Thank you for coming out to hear about a subject which I find fascinating, and I hope you will too, and that is brick. So I think to dive right into it, we're going to start with real old brick, and that's Roman brick. Because the Romans, well, they did a very important thing. They learned how to fire bricks, fire the clay, to make the bricks really hard. Because up until then, most of the bricks were mud bricks, sun-dried. So Roman bricks are very durable. And Roman bricks provided the main structure for most of the buildings of ancient Rome, but they didn't leave the bricks exposed. They usually covered them over with plaster or marble veneer. And we see the Basilica Maxentius and Constantine, which is now stripped of nearly all of its ornament, and we see in this arch here the very precise construction of brick in Roman times. Now, Roman bricks are very thin. They're almost slabs. The average size was 12 by 3.5 by just 1.5 inches thick. And I cut out a piece of paper to give you some idea of a Roman brick. It's very thin. This is about the standard size. Now, they look bigger than this because we're not filling in visually with the mortar joints. Roman brick can be quite sophisticated. This is the Market of Trajan, showing broken pediments, full entablature, nice arches, but you have to remember that this was originally covered over with plaster. The brick wasn't meant to be shown. It was a structural element rather than a decorative element, not to be exposed. Interestingly, in the late 19th, early 20th century, Roman brick became very fashionable again. You see a lot of American Renaissance buildings built of Roman brick, such as Carnegie Hall. These very thin bricks, nice golden color. Or in Philadelphia, red Roman bricks here, thin golden yellow bricks in this house next door. Not that unusual. Now, Roman bricks are perfectly acquirable today. Go online and you can find companies that make Roman bricks that you can buy. And I wish we would use more of it. Of course, being from Richmond, I have to show a Richmond example. This lovely golden speckled brick here, used in our Main Street's railroad station with a lot of rich terracotta decoration. But Roman brick really makes this, I think, a really fascinating, impressive work of architecture. And Frank Lloyd Wright knew the advantage of Roman brick. Because of its overwhelming horizontality, it was perfect for the horizontality of his prairie-style houses, such as the Roby House in Chicago. Again, Roman bricks are perfectly acquirable today, and I hope people will realize that this and many of the other examples of bricks I show are design resources that can be used for modern architecture. We don't realize the design advantages of brick. They can be very subtle but very beautiful in their own ways. Okay. Just a quick word about brick making in the colonial period. We were making bricks in Virginia in the early 17th century. Bricks in colonial period, usually made on site, using wooden molds. This is a real 18th century wooden mold. The molds were dusted with sand, a very fine sand, as you see in this demonstration here, so the wet clay wouldn't adhere to the sides of the brick mold. It'd slip out easily. And that gave the bricks a kind of granular surface. Now, that wasn't true in New England. The predominant way of making bricks up there is what they call slop joints. Instead of dusting the molds with sand, they dipped them in water. And that made the clay slip out more easily. And then they were sent for firing in kilns such as this. This is a demonstration in Williamsburg. You build this big brick structure here, put all the bricks in here, the green bricks that are to be fired. You have these fire channels in which you stick logs, and you burn it for about 7 days or so. You got to be very careful to modulate the temperature. If you let it get too hot, you're going to end up with one huge brick. If you don't fire it exactly right, you get an awful lot of waste. And there was a lot of waste under any circumstance. Maybe 20–30% of the bricks were not all that usable or not hard enough to use, particularly in exterior walls. Now, the art of making bricks from the Roman period pretty much died out in the Dark Ages. In the Dark Ages and Middle Ages, most buildings were wooden structures, or fortified buildings were made out of stone. Brick making almost disappeared, but was revived particularly in England in the Tudor period. And a foremost example of that is Hampton Court Palace, built for Cardinal Wolsey, and it was such an impressive palace that Henry VIII said, I want that for myself. So he kicked Wolsey out and took it over. But this really made brick architecture fashionable. It became a royal palace, and lots of medieval towns and villages were rebuilt in brick in a big period of rebuilding in the Tudor period, such as we see here in King's Lynn. These post-medieval structures date pretty much from the Tudor period. Still get timber frame buildings, but they would fill in between the timber members with brick infill. Brick nogging was called. Sometimes they would cover it over with plaster, and later on they would cover it over with what they call tile hangings. But lots of brick structures coming in the Tudor period. All right, we're now going to look at some brick bonds. How do you make these bricks structurally sound, make a strict structure out of them? The primary bond used in the Tudor period and in England well into the 19th century, and even today, was what we call English bond. It was so common in Europe, or in England then, that they pretty much just called it common bond. And it was not only for buildings, walls, but for retaining walls, for bridges. Lots of English structure is built out of what we would call English bond. And it's mainly just a functional bond, not meant to be very decorative. It's a row of stretchers, sides of bricks, alternating with a row of headers, ends of bricks. And you start them off with a little brick fragment called a queen closer so that the vertical joints don't align. That's English bond. Very common bond in Britain. And we look at again these buildings at King's Lynn. They're all English bond, a row of stretchers alternating with a row of headers in every other course. It's the strongest bond. The earliest datable building in Virginia is this structure, Bacon's Castle, dating from the 1660s. Now this gives a very false impression of what most people were living in the 17th century in Virginia. Most of them were living in earth-based structures which have all disappeared. This was a very exceptional building for its time with curvilinear Dutch-type gables, diagonally set chimneys, and in high Jacobean style. But the wall, we look up close, as you would expect, is all English bond, a row of stretchers alternating with a row of headers in every course. And you see this little shelf here. That's called a water table. And that's just caused by the thickness of the foundation. The thickness was expressed on the exterior of the building. So you get this little shelf. Because the foundation's got to hold up an awful lot of bricks. It has to be a lot thicker than the main wall. And then we have a relieving arch over this basement window. And that's to spread the weight. There's an awful lot of weight coming down on this window here. So this spreads that weight around on either side. A relieving arch, it relieves the window of all that pressure. Again, not a very decorative bond, a functional bond. And you see it has very granular surface. Because brick molds were lined with sand. English bond continued to be used for the entire structure, particularly in Virginia, up into the early couple of decades of the 18th century, and then it just passed out of fashion. It was still used in the foundations, as we will see, but you rarely see a whole building built of English bond as you do in this 1720s house, and I'll come back to this in a little while to show you some of the detailing on it. However, English bond continued to be used in other places, such as Charleston, South Carolina, well into the late 18th century for sidewalls here. Front wall, you can see, is stuccoed over, but sidewalls are all in English bond. And English bond saw a revival in the early 20th century with the fashion of doing Tudor revival style buildings, such as this big house in Richmond, Virginia. Correctly, it's all in English bond, as you would expect of a real Tudor building. and even in some institutional buildings. Now, Virginians are all Anglophiles, so they want their institutional buildings to look like English buildings, so we have a Georgian-style Virginia Museum of Fine Arts for which English bond was used throughout the building, which I like here. I think it gives this building some character. It's a big monumental building, and this strong bond, I think, is appropriate for this type of building. All right, couple of odd bonds. Dutch cross bond and English cross bond. What are we talking about? Dutch cross bond in Amsterdam particularly, and nearly all 17th and early 18th century brick architecture in the Netherlands is in what we call Dutch cross bond. Here is a close-up of Dutch cross bond. It's like English bond, a row of stretchers alternating with a row of headers, but in a very particular way. Let's look at a header. Above it is a joint, below it is a stretcher. Let's look at another header. Above it is a stretcher, below it is a joint. It alternates like this. It's not that easy to lay, so that you get diagonal step patterns throughout the wall, like this. These diagonal step patterns throughout. Dutch bricks are very small. 6 by 3 by 1 3/4. That's not a big brick. Here is about the size of a Dutch brick. It's a little thin brick. Pretty universal for Dutch buildings and Dutch brickwork. Diagonals. And interestingly, in Holland, they produce an awful lot of little yellow Dutch bricks, which are often used for paving. And these yellow bricks were imported to England in some quantity. And some of them actually made it to Virginia in the early 17th century. We found in an archaeological site some yellow Dutch bricks, particularly the one in the middle here. And look at the scale. It's only about 1.5 inches thick. Not many of these are found, but maybe they were brought over for paving or maybe a hearth, but not much more. There just weren't that many of them. We very often hear that early colonial buildings were built out of bricks brought over from England. Well, some of them were brought over as ballast. But you have to remember that it takes nearly 100,000 bricks to build a 2-story brick building that's maybe 45 by 45. So, no, we didn't bring that many bricks over here to build buildings like Bacon's Castle. They were built on site. And very often houses were located near a clay deposit because the bricks were built in, formed on site and were formed in temporary kilns called clamps. So when you say English brick or find English brick written into the record, what they normally mean is an English statute brick. That was a standard size decreed by law in the Tudor period. Now, over here, we didn't follow the rules all that quickly, so there can be variation in sizes of bricks. But this is about the size of an English statute brick here. Again, this looks small to us because we're not counting visually for the mortar joints around it. But this is an English statute brick. Okay. In some cases up north, such as on this Dutch manor house, Van Cortlandt Manor, early 18th century, you see some Dutch yellow bricks, probably imported, used to get tight fit at the window jambs. And in this Dutch colonial house in Old Kinderhook, New York, done with red clay rather than yellow clay. These bricks were undoubtedly made on site. But if you look carefully, there are these small Dutch bricks, and if you look, you can see the diagonal patterning in the way they're laid. English or Dutch cross bond. Okay. Now, English cross bond is exactly the same thing, except they're using English-sized bricks rather than Dutch bricks. Now, this is a 20th century apartment house using English cross bond. And you see it creates these same diagonal patterns throughout the wall. I wish we'd use more of it. I think you can make a building very interesting. But one example, which is quite striking, is the old Church of Christ in Wethersfield, Connecticut. If you look kind of cross-eyed at it, you can see the diagonal patterning running through the brickwork here. gives some liveliness to a brick wall. And it saw some sort of revival in the 20th century. Here's a building by McKim, Mead & White down at the University of North Carolina. If you look carefully at it, you can see it is English cross bond with the diagonal patterning running through wall surface. And a very recent example of that is this reconstructed chapel of a version of a Jesuit chapel at St. Mary's City in Maryland, completed latest 2007. And I guess in the archaeological debris of this church, they had some indication that it was English cross bond. And if you can look at the wall, you can see these diagonal patternings running through. But so far, I have not seen an early example of this in Virginia, or even Maryland for that matter, except for this one. Now you see these holes in the brick. Those are called put-log holes. When you build a brick wall, the masons have to stand on scaffolding. And the scaffolding was anchored into the walls as they went up. And normally, as they finished the building and took the scaffolding down, they would usually fill in these put-log holes, but not often. You can find put-log holes in colonial buildings. There's one in Williamsburg on the Duke of Gloucester Street, still has put-log holes in it. And so every Christmas, the owner fills those put-log holes with nice big apples for Christmas decoration. Okay, Flemish bond. The standard bond, particularly for fine quality buildings and facades later on in the 18th and early 19th century. It's a decorative bond. And Flemish bond is a stretcher alternating with a header, alternating with a stretcher in every course throughout the wall's surface. And to get the headers centered over the stretchers, you have to start out the wall with a little queen closer here. Or you can do it with a 3/4 size brick called a king closer. Now, Flemish bond, far as we know, was done in Flanders, and some of those Flemish masons came over to England in the 17th century. There's not much of it there. Some people are not exactly sure, scholars are not exactly sure where Flemish bond really originated. I've seen a version of it in Munich. Some say there's versions of it in Poland. But for our purposes, the first really serious example of Flemish bond in Britain is this house, the so-called Dutch house, Kew Palace and Kew Gardens. It's out of London, dating from the 1630s. A very elaborate display of brickwork here. Maybe you can make out here that it is, the main wall surfaces are Flemish bond. And as far as most brickwork scholars in Britain are concerned, there are no other earlier examples of a building using Flemish bond throughout the entire wall in England. So this was a landmark structure, and it's important for dating purposes. For instance, this is St. Luke's Church in Isle of Wight County, Virginia, traditionally dated to the 1630s. Well, yes, it's a Gothic-style building, what we call remembered forms, because when the settlers came over here, they built parish churches remembering how they looked in England, which were old medieval Gothic-style churches. So this is a Gothic building. And everybody wants to think that this is the oldest church of Anglo-America, 1630s. I always question that date because the church is entirely of Flemish bond, except for the buttresses, which are English bond. And you have to remember, they weren't doing Flemish bond in England until the 1630s, and it's hardly likely that they were doing it in Virginia in the 1630s. And lo and behold, we finally did some dendrochronology on this church and came in at 1680. So it's a very, very late example of what we call Gothic survival, particularly when you think that when this church was being built, St. Paul's Cathedral by Wren was being built in London. So it's backward-looking architecturally, but a bit forward-looking structurally with the use of Flemish bond. Here's a close-up of Flemish bond on another church in Virginia dating from the 1730s using glazed headers. It's a way of really decorating your church and making it decorative looking. Glazed headers were formed because when you stack the bricks in the kiln for firing, the headers are closest to the heat source, and they were glazed just like a piece of pottery. And you can see where the glazing has spilled over onto this stretcher here. And they use this byproduct of the firing decoratively by giving this checkerboard pattern. Now, one thing. To make these lovely light blue glazed headers, you have to use oak to fire the kilns. If you used a softwood like pine or poplar, doesn't get blue glazing because the potassium or potash in the oak has a chemical reaction with the clay to produce the blue. If you use something else, going to turn the headers black. Don't get these blue headers. And notice these bricks were made on site out in the countryside, and look how uneven they are there. And I'll talk more about mortar joints in a bit. It's an uneven product, but it gives a wonderful overall effect, particularly when the sun hits these glazed headers and can make a building just sparkle like the Ludwell Paradise House here in Williamsburg. All right, here's a close-up of another colonial church with a very beautiful example of glazed header Flemish bond. And you notice these richer color bricks on the corners here. Those are rub bricks. And they were selected for their even color, for their hardness, and you rub them smooth with another brick or stone, and you can do it yourself, to get a very smooth surface as opposed to those granular surfaces on the main bricks. And that was to give an accent at the corner and also to give you a nice straight edge on the corner, as opposed to below the water table here. That's done in English bond because English bond is a stronger bond. Some people say it's 11% stronger than Flemish bond. So very often you'll see English bond below the water table, Flemish bond above. Not always. You can sometimes see Flemish bond below the water table. But rubbed brick dressings on the corner here makes a beautiful accent for a brick wall. And that's precisely what was going on in England at the time. A lot of these masons came over to Virginia because they worked for rebuilding of London after the Great Fire of London, and when most of those buildings got built by the early decades of the 18th century, they were just out of work. So these were very skilled masons that came to Virginia to do this work, and other colonies as well. So this is a house in Rye, England, later lived in by Henry James, but it's precisely what we have in Virginia. Flemish bond with glazed headers, English bond below the water table. Well, not all brickwork is all that consistent. This is one of my favorite churches, this little church, Yacomico Church, dating from 1701. Masons got in a real brick fight here. One mason said, it's the 18th century, I'm going to do Flemish bond with glazed headers. Well, the guy said, well, I don't know about that. I'm going to do English bond over it. Well, wait a minute. If you're going to do English bond, at least you could do alternating glazed headers in your English bond to kind of make it blend with my Flemish bond. Well, no, when we get over here, I don't know when. So brickwork wags call this Flemish bond, spelled P-H-L-E-G-M-I-S-H. Okay. So not all of it is so beautifully consistent. That's what makes, I think, early brickwork so interesting. You can see what's going on with some of these guys. You get the same thing with this church, St. Peter's Church in Virginia. This, incidentally, was the parish church of Martha Washington. She wasn't married here. She was married at home. The body of the church is 1700. It has Flemish gables, just like Bacon's Castle or Kew Palace. The tower is kind of Baroque, added later in the 1730s with good Flemish bond with glazed headers, these big, strong pilasters, and urns. Baroque. One of these urns is actually a chimney, which really added to the Baroque flavoring to it. But let's look at the main wall. Okay, the mason, traditional mason, starting off, well, all right, I'll do English bond below the water table like you're supposed to do. But hey, it's now the 18th century. I guess I ought to be doing Flemish bond. All right, so I'll start off with Flemish bond. Well, wait a minute, I'm not sure what about, I don't know about this Flemish bond. I wasn't know about that, so okay, I better go back to doing something I know what I'm doing. So it continues in English bond for the rest of the building. Now, talking about glazed headers. Philadelphia It was largely a city of brick. It was the second largest city in the British Empire at that time, second only to London. A lot of fine brick buildings there, but you see all black headers. It's because they weren't using oak. They were using maybe pine, or maybe by the time this was built, maybe coal. Big city, 1773, but this is pretty standard for Flemish bond in Philadelphia, black headers, not your lovely light blue glazed headers. In Virginia, by the mid-18th century, they kind of stopped exposing the glazed headers. They still were producing them, but they just turned them around in the wall, facing inward. Some say that's because, particularly in Tidewater, Virginia, around Williamsburg, they were running out of oak. They were having to use other things, and they didn't get the nice blue glazed headers, so they just didn't use them. So in a very fine house, such as Carter's Grove, you get a consistent, even-colored wall surface here. All right, a couple of other really odd bonds. Either it's something called Dutch bond in the UK. In this country, we call it staggered Flemish, or also zipper bond. Very rare, but what it is, it's a Flemish bond, stretcher alternating with a header in every course, but instead of the stretchers centered over a header, or vice versa, they're slightly pushed so that the headers kind of align in vertical stripes. It's very rare, but it can be interesting. And a couple of examples of it. This is a treasurer's office in Virginia dating from the 1830s. And you see what happens. You get this kind of vertical striping in the wall. Over in the Shenandoah Valley, which they still were producing glazed headers pretty late, you get the striping with glazed headers, and that's why sometimes over there it's called zipper bond. Now that wasn't a historic term because zippers weren't invented when this building was built, but it gives a very interesting effect. No reason why it couldn't be used on a modern building. Now, this is a building out in Kentucky dating from the 1850s, and it has a very unusual bond, which I'm not sure has got a firm name on it. Well, sometimes it's called monk bond in England. This is the only example I've seen of this in America, except one possibly 17th century example in Virginia. But what monk bond is a header alternating with two stretchers. A header alternating with two stretchers. The next course, header alternating with two stretchers, and so forth throughout the wall. So you do get a kind of vertical aligning of headers here. I think it's a very effective bond, and I'd like to see it used more often. Monk bond, two stretchers to every header. All header bond. This is a wall built with all headers exposed, no stretchers in the facade. This is a thin wall. Actually, an all-header bond building would be a thicker wall, and it'd be more like this. This is from Batty Langley's pattern book on brickwork, showing that you do have all headers in the surface of the wall, but you make it by using a half brick alternating with a stretcher, alternating with a half brick, alternating with a stretcher. It's trouble to make, but it gives the effect of all headers. Very common in southern England in 18th century buildings, such as this building in Hampshire, all header bond. But this is a house in Winchester on the Cathedral Close there. All header glazed headers, set off by the rub brick dressings around the windows here. Gives a very interesting effect for a building. If you really want to make your brick building stand out, use all glazed headers with rub brick dressings, rich rub brick dressings. Peculiar, particularly to Hampshire County in England. In Annapolis and around Annapolis on a few important houses, they must have had some masons from southern England, because it's the one place where you find all header bond buildings, such as the Bryce House. You won't find it many other places in America that I know of. So the facade of the Bryce house is all header bond. Sidewall is English bond, something you would not get in Virginia this period. We just weren't using English bond then. The facades of the dependencies are in Flemish bond. Here's a close-up of the Bryce house, all header bond. It's been quite effective. Batty Langley in his treatise on brickwork said that header bond is the most beautiful of brickwork bonds. There were a couple of examples of all header bond in Virginia. One got lost in a hurricane in the 1930s. The only one left, only house left that uses all header bond is this house called Williams Ordinary in Dumfries, Virginia. Probably built by Maryland Masons, because Dumfries was a little port town right across the bay from Maryland. And the wall is all header bond, accented with Aquia Creek stone quoins. This is right near the Aquia Creek quarry, which provided sandstone for building both the White House and the National Capitol. But this is that same stone. One example of the 20th century using all header bond is this house, Georgian Revival House by William Lawrence Bottomley on Monument Avenue in Richmond. Very English in its style, but for whatever reason, Mr. Bottomley decided he would try using header bond. Fine, glad to have it. Garden wall bond, or what we call American bond, or also what in England they call Liverpool bond. It's not a decorative bond, it's more a functional bond, but it's a row of headers alternating with an odd number of courses of stretchers. In this case, 3 courses of stretchers to a row of headers. Garden wall bond. Not very pretty. Interestingly, it was used very early in New England. This is the short house dating from 1715. The side walls are in 3 course, what we call American bond, or the English would call Liverpool bond, to a course of headers. A functional bond. One of the few 18th century houses left in downtown Boston is the Old Corner Bookstore. It's done in 3 course American bond. But if you look up in the gable here, 3 courses of stretchers to a row of headers, 3 courses of stretchers to a row of headers. Brickwork is very worked over. It's hard to find good examples of untouched brick up north because the weather's so hard on it. And the bricks spall or the mortar joints fall out and they do bad pointing on it. Very often the bricks have been painted and they do sandblasting on it, which ruins the bricks. And I won't go into that now. I'll get to it later. 3-course American bond, as far as I know, was not used in Virginia in the colonial period at all. This is the front wall of one of the ranges on the University of Virginia, dating from 1817. 3-course American bond. 3 courses of stretchers to a row of headers. This is the University of Virginia, designed by Thomas Jefferson, and that section of the facade of the student rooms is using that brick. I think Jefferson, who was a connoisseur of good brickwork, came riding down from Monticello and said, "No, you fools, I didn't want 3-course American bond. This is the first building built at the university." He said, "I wanted Flemish bond on the facades of the student rooms." So there is a sharp break. There's just a short section of that 3-course American. Then all of the rest of the facades on the lawn are Flemish bond. Not sure. And then the side walls of the pavilions and the back walls of the student rooms are built in another functional bond, not decorative at all, and that's a slightly cheaper bond. That's 5-course of stretchers to a row of headers. They didn't even bother to tool the joints here. It's not pretty brickwork, it's just a functional wall here. It's facadism. The fronts of the pavilions are very beautiful Flemish bond, which I'll show in a minute, but 5 courses of stretchers to a row of headers. All right, Flemish stretcher bond, another variation. That is 3 courses usually of stretchers to a row of stretcher header, as in Flemish bond. British call it Flemish stretcher bond. Here we call it American bond with Flemish variation, because that's what it is. You won't necessarily see it on facades. It's usually on sidewalls. This is a courthouse built by Jeffersonian workmen. The front's very fine Flemish bond, but the sidewall is in this three-course American bond with Flemish variation. And you see this high tide mark here. That's because these courthouses didn't have basements. They have very shallow foundations, and they hadn't discovered the use of a damp-proof course here at that time. So you get rising damp up to this point and makes all the mortar joints fall out, and they come along and do cruddy repointing. But above it, the wall's in pretty good shape. Here it is. Stretcher header, stretcher header, stretcher headers in Flemish, then 3 rows of stretchers, then, of course, Flemish alternating, stretcher header, stretcher header. It's a kind of cheap way of getting the appearance of Flemish bond. Pretty nicely tooled joints. This is not all that precise here. You almost get vertical alignment of joints here, which is not good. You need to center them. Here is a much more precise example of this sort of thing, where the joints are centered over the headers properly. So you get stretcher header, then 3 rows of stretchers, stretcher header. Nicely tooled joints, early 19th century. Stretcher bond. This is a wall of all stretchers and no headers shown. Well, how do you do that and make a structurally sound wall? Well, here is an example of all stretcher bond on a little country Greek Revival church in Virginia. No headers. Well, how do you get a proper bond this way? Well, very cleverly, you use a square brick. You use a whole course of square bricks, and that ties it into the backing bricks. But it appears just as an ordinary stretcher on the surface. And they thought this was a pretty hot stuff, because here is a house in Lexington, Virginia, with all stretcher bond on the facade and Flemish bond on the secondary walls. In other words, they consider this higher in the hierarchy of brick bonds than Flemish bond. Stretcher bond is very common on new brick structures, but realize this is not a brick building. Most of these are just frame buildings, and the brick is just a veneer. And to use Flemish bond or something else, they'd have to break all the bricks in half to get the headers, and they're not going to go to that expense, so they just do all stretchers. So don't be fooled, because this is not real stretcher bond. The brick isn't bonded at all. This is just one brick thick. All right, we're going to look at some colonial brick details now. This is a close-up of the window of the George Wythe House, dating from the 1750s in Williamsburg. And you see the rub brick around the jambs of the windows, slightly lighter color. And you do that rub brick because you don't only want the corners to have precise edges. You want a tight fit around the window frame itself. So you use precisely shaped rubbed bricks for that. And then we have something else up here, which I will talk about right now. So when you use the rub brick around the windows, and particularly in London when they have these black bricks, which I'll talk about in a minute, it gives a very striking effect. And then you get precise bricks in these arches called gauge bricks. And here's a close-up of the gauge brick, what we call a jack arch or flat arch across the top of the windows at Carter's Grove. This is very fine construction. To do a gauge brick is a rub brick cut to a very special shape to get all of these really parallelogram shaped bricks. If you took all of these lines down to a single point, they'd meet about here in the middle of the window. And these are very thin joints of lime putty. There's hardly any sand in it. They're barely 1/8 or even 1/16 of an inch wide. Very precise. And they're not all real joints. A lot of these are just scribed joints in the surface of the brick and filled with lime putty. So this may or may not be a real joint here, but it's very fine craftsmanship. And they are kind of a veneer. You have just the brick rub brick jack arches or gauge brick jack arches as a window lintel, but structurally reinforced behind by a timber beam here, because a lot of brick, a lot of weight is being forced down on the top of this window when you have a multi-story building. So you have to, the gauge brick arch wouldn't be strong enough to support all that, so you have to reinforce it with a timber behind it. So think of it almost just as a veneer. Now, we got away from doing that sort of thing in Virginia after the Revolution. This is not a very good gauge brick jack arch. In fact, it's not gauged at all. They're just ordinary bricks stuck in the best way they could, because the period of apprenticeship in Virginia and much of colonial America before the Revolution was about 5 to 7 years. After the Revolution, the period of apprenticeship reduced to about 2 years. What that meant was, during that long apprenticeship system, the apprentice was doing a lot of the rubbing and cutting of all the bricks. The mason, the master mason, was just laying the bricks. So after the Revolution, he lost a lot of that labor, so they just didn't bother doing that kind of fine gauge brick work over the windows. Or they fit them in just like this, or sometimes they've used a stone or a wooden lintel. So use of fine gauge brick disappears largely out of after the Revolution. All right, jumping back before the Revolution, in eastern Virginia, where you didn't have good building stone, if you wanted fine architectural detailing, such as a pediment, you had to use brick. So you used gauge brick, specially molded and cut and sawn brick to create this nice pediment. That's a real work of craftsmanship. That's on the Public Records Office in Williamsburg. They're fairly standard on fine brick buildings in the colonial period, particularly on churches. Churches exhibited the best masonry. And you see on this Virginia country church here a molded and gauge brick pediment, spot on with what was going on in London at pretty much the same time. Because there's not good building stone around London, so a lot of the London brick buildings, if they wanted nice architectural detailing like this, they had to use brick. So again, we had good masons brought over from England in the colonial period, and they could do this kind of work. A supreme example of this is on this church, Christ Church, Lancaster County, Virginia. But look at all of this fine brickwork here. You have molded bricks forming a pulvinated frieze. Then you have bricks cut to form all these little dentils, and then you have a segmental arch and specially molded bricks with dentils going around. This is as fine as it gets. This is as good as anything as you're going to get in Britain in this period. It was undoubtedly done by British masons. Now, you could get it carried to the extreme, such as this garden niche in the Privy Garden of Hampton Court Palace. If you really want to go all the way, you can do gauge brick, recessed arch such as this. And this was probably color washed. It looks like an evidence of paint on here. And the more we examine some of our colonial buildings, we find that color wash was used. They found evidence of color wash on this pedimented doorway here. In other words, the whole thing was covered with a red coating, usually an iron oxide paint mixed with linseed oil, to even out, to cover up the joints, to make it appear more as a unified architectural structure. And maybe the joints would be highlighted in white, as we see here, because you didn't want to hide all of this fine detailing in here. Okay, going back to the Lynnhaven house, a couple of things to point out. Even though this looks like a very simple little brick cottage, this is an upscale house for its time. Most people were living in simple wooden shacks that have all disappeared, but you find nice brick string courses here on the chimney. Chimney is a nice work of art. It's a T-shaped chimney with a plaster band in the chimney just to give it accent. Relieving arch over the doorway here. English bond throughout, and you have these haunches on the chimney called weatherings. And when you have bricks laid flat like this, they're called tiled weatherings, which is a misnomer because they're not really tiles. But they were tiles in England, and here is a house of about that same period in Hampshire again. And you see that the weatherings are covered with ceramic tiles, usually roofing tiles. So we just use that term for a different sort of thing. Sometimes, and it's very rare, you get what's called tumbled courses. And this is, instead of tiled weatherings, the weatherings are cut in such a way that you get diagonal bricks here, so you get a flat surface on the haunches themselves. It's called tumbled courses. Rare, but not unique. And the Dutch used it a lot. If we go back to that Dutch house we saw earlier, you see that the gable has tumbled courses in it to get a flat line, even line for the gables here, tumbled courses. Now, diapering. That became common in Tudor England, and you see an example of it on Hampton Court Palace here. You use glazed headers to create these diagonal patterns throughout the wall surface, and they can get quite elaborate. Why do we call it diapering? Well, the explanation is in the town of Ypres, Y-P-R-E-S, in Belgium. It was famous for making special square-cut cloth, which was shipped in large quantities to England in that period. Now, the English are not genetically disposed to pronounce French properly. So they're not going to say Ypres, Ypres. They said wipers because that's the way it's spelled, Y-P-R-E-S. And if the cloth comes from wipers, it's spelled D''Y-P-R-E-S. And what does that spell? Diapers. So that's why they called it diapering, because it reminded them of that square-cut cloth coming from from Belgium at that time. Diapering was used on the continent. Here is a French house done with black headers, a early 17th century house. And you get a lot of it for some reason in New Jersey. New Jersey has some really wild brickwork in it. Here's this Nicholson house in Salem, but look at all the diapering patterns. Sometimes it can have initials, sometimes it can have dates in the glazed headers. This is nice Flemish bond facade. It probably had a pent roof here, which is not, this house is under restoration, which has not been put back in place, because there's definitely break in the Flemish bond. And a rare example in South Carolina, pretty elaborate example of diapering in this mid-18th century house. Or other versions of decorative use of glazed headers. You get it sometimes in Virginia, sometimes in Maryland, chevroning pattern. In other words, parallel rows paralleling the gable slope here, chevroning. Now, diapering saw a resurgence in Tudor Revival period. Here's a house in Richmond, Virginia, using diapering in the gable and a little bit of tumbling right there. This is good brickwork. Some of the Tudor Revival houses exhibit very fine craftsmanship. Molded brick cornices, very popular in late 18th century. Especially molded bricks. Instead of using a wooden cornice, you use molded bricks to make a cornice. This was over in the Shenandoah Valley, and the Shenandoah Valley was largely settled by people coming up the valley, settling in the Shenandoah Valley, coming from Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, where there's a lot of molded brick cornices, such as in Elfreth's Alley here, and that was done primarily for fireproofing. Instead of using a wooden cornice, you use a brick cornice, because it's more fireproof. And here it's got the fire company's shield on the house, show that you paid insurance. If your house caught on fire, the company would come out and put it out. If you didn't have a shield on it, you were out of luck. Your house just burned. Another decorative feature that was prevalent, particularly in the early 18th century, if not the late 17th century, are called sometimes houndstooth courses or mouse-tooth courses. Those are bricks laid on a diagonal sticking out just for decoration, Died out in the early 18th century and saw a revival in the late 18th century and early 19th century. This is a house in Richmond. This is a house over in the Shenandoah Valley. These houndstooth or dog's tooth courses. Here's a double dog's tooth or houndstooth cornice over in the Shenandoah Valley. Decorative pattern, still could be used today. All right, water tables. Remember I talked about the thickening of the foundation. Well, in New England, they laid specially molded bricks on top of the water table to throw the water away, to make this more decorative, to look more like a classical pedestal. But they were laid vertically. Here's a close-up of the Old South Meeting House in Boston. Molded bricks laid vertically on the water table. In Virginia, it's just a regional thing. We capped our water tables with diagonal bricks, or sometimes molded bricks, but always laid horizontally. So above an English bond foundation, Flemish bond with glazed headers above, rub brick corners. Carter's Grove, being a very fancy house, had a molded water table, brick courses to echo a classical pedestal, but that's more sophisticated than most. After the Revolution, for whatever reason, they decided to thicken the foundation towards the interior rather than the exterior, so the wall surface goes straight down to grade. Nice Flemish bond in the main part of the wall, but the fact that this is below this is in the main part of the foundation, they thought, well, I guess we got to do a different brickwork here, so they did what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-course American bond. Why they didn't carry Flemish bond all the way down to grade, I don't know, but they just didn't do it. All right, some word about mortar joints. This is a close-up of that wall at St. John's Church I showed you earlier. You see how uneven the bricks are, because they're made under pretty primitive conditions. So you don't get nice, even sides and ends of the bricks. To even out the joints, so I mean that means the brick joints are very irregular. To even them out visually, they usually scribe them with little thin lines, sometimes called a struck joint, sometimes called a grapevine joint. They're called all different things, or just an incised or scribed joints. In England, sometimes they're called penny joints, because the masons, if they didn't have a proper tool, they would take the old English pennies, a big penny, and with a straight edge would use that to make the little line in the mortar joint. Well, that does two things. From a distance, it evens them out visually, and it also serves to compress the joints. If you push it in, it just makes the mortar a little tighter. So it served a couple of purposes. Now, in Virginia, at least, in eastern Virginia, we didn't have any limestone, and you need lime to make mortar. So to make up for that, they burnt oyster shells. Well, this is sometimes called shell mortar. They burn the shells to make the lime, and in most of this shell mortar, you can see little flecks of oyster shell. And also, because they're using oyster shell, and usually a local sand, which is very white, gives you very white joints, not tan joints like you might see elsewhere, shell mortar. Now, in a more sophisticated masonry bag, you would have a jointer for making these scribed or penny joints, and there is the jointer there. It's this thing here, you would line that up with one of those straight edges up here and make your scribed joint that way, rather than relying on a English penny. And that was done in England. Here's a close-up of a very sophisticated house, Wimpole Hall by James Gibbs, but you see exactly that same kind of mortar joint as we saw in Colonial, Virginia. Scribe joints here. Now, after the Revolution in America, brick-making methods got much more improved. You could get a much more even product. The kilns were improved. They could fire the bricks more evenly. So you get a very precise brick. And they got away from those scribe joints, and they used what's called ribbon joints. So these are joints that are very carefully tooled on top and bottom, but are very flat on the surface, just like a ribbon. See how flat this is here on the surface. Don't have to do a line down the middle. And this is good brickwork. This is good Flemish bond, because when it's done right like this, the vertical joints are all thinner than the horizontal joints, making for a very precise, beautiful product. Ribbon joints. An extreme example of that is on the rotunda at the University of Virginia. Ribbon joints. All of the vertical joints are considerably thinner than the horizontal joints, and these are all very carefully tooled at top and bottom. And you have to remember that this was all done on a circular building. And Jefferson said, "This is the finest brickwork I've ever seen." It was done by, as far as we know, by Philadelphia masons. They came down doing this right. So Jefferson demanded quality product. Okay, oil brick. So if you wanted a very smooth surface on these early 19th century buildings, you could use what's called oil brick, and that's where the mold was lined with copper. And instead of dusting it with sand to let the green bricks slide out for firing, you wiped it with linseed oil. So you get a very smooth surface on the face of the brick. And oil brick was specified for all of the facades of the pavilions at the University of Virginia. Again, Jefferson was a connoisseur of fine brickwork, wanted to make sure they got good stuff there. So here is oil brick on one of the pavilion facades. You see, instead of a granular surface, it's very smooth surface. They ought to fire the painter who splashed all this paint on here, but I started to Photoshop all those paint dots out, but I thought I'd better not. I just better show it as it is sometimes. But you can see very nice ribbon joints throughout. Let's go to painted brick. Now, I showed that earlier photograph of Kew Palace with its Flemish bond. Now, the thing is, you can't see that Flemish bond today because the building has been color washed, and they found that that was an original treatment. And we find more and more that that was an original treatment for many of our colonial buildings, and particularly for federal period buildings, which I'll explain in a minute. Color washed to make the buildings just a much more overall even surface appearance. So, looking closely at some of our federal period buildings where the surface is protected, and this is one of the pavilion facades at UVA because it's protected under the portico, we see that indeed it was color washed, red, an iron oxide paint, probably mixed with linseed oil or something else. Sometimes they mix blood to get the color. And then you can see that all the surface and the mortar joints were color washed, and then the joints were all painted over with a white paint, a thin lime paint called penciling. Penciling meant back then not what we would call a pencil, but it meant a thin brush, a little thin pointed brush is where they would paint all the mortar joints. That's a lot of work. But they wanted their brickwork, which is handmade bricks, to look like the very precise bricks that you were getting in the cities. So this was a way of doing it. Now, to prove that this indeed was done, this is the American Builder's Price Book and Estimator by James Gallier that came out in 1836. He's talking about what each part of the brickwork laborers cost, what the charges are, price estimating. And he says, you get a price for brick fronts painted one coat and the joints drawn white per yard, 3 cents a yard. It's a lot of work for 3 cents. But the more we look at brickwork, particularly the federal period, where it's been protected either behind shutters or under a porch, you see that that was indeed the treatment. Eventually it'll wash off. But this is stretcher bond on an 1840s house, and you can see it's a very even color red. Where the penciling has worn, you can see that there was red under there, meaning that the whole surface was painted red, and then the joints were penciled with the white joints. A lot of brick was just painted to make it look like it was either stone or stucco. This is the Virginia governor's mansion, dating from 1813. It was originally exposed red brick, and we know that about 20 years later, to give it a more sophisticated federal look, it was painted this nice vanilla color with the trim picked out in white. Not at all uncommon. I like painted brick. Washington and Lee, the colonnade, was all red washed, color washed, because these buildings, they all look like a unified architectural composition. It really wasn't. They were built at different periods, and to, I think, even them out visually, they have kept, even up to today, all painted red. No penciling on this, it's all just red wash. Very often, houses or brick houses were painted a lighter color just to update them, to give them a different effect. Nothing wrong with painted brick. Now, the important point to remember is that if you're patient, all paint will eventually wear off of brick. Just takes time. You don't have to do anything to it. All right, tuck pointing. We often use the term tuck pointing, meaning that we're going to repoint the bricks. No, that is not tuck pointing. Tuck pointing traditionally is what's described in that Gallier book. Tuck pointing says with a neat joint on new work per foot, superficial, 4 cents a yard. So what tuck pointing is, you do a normal mortar joint, then you scribe out a little groove in all of the joints. Then you fill that groove with a very thin, neat line of very white mortar, and makes the brickwork look very precise. It's a lot of work. Tuck pointing was fairly common in London. London, of course, burnt a lot of soft coal, and all the brick buildings turned black. And they were often tuck pointed rather than cleaned off or repainted to give the appearance, or to show the mortar joints. And the gauge brick jack arches were sometimes cleaned to show that they were red to contrast with the black brick wall. Now, most of these buildings are built out of what's called London cream-colored or yellow stock brick. And next door they made the, well, I think it's an error, to clean it all off. So you cleaned off the tuck pointing, you cleaned off the black soot that's been building up here, you've lost the patina, and I don't think it's all that attractive. Most of London is built out of, Georgian London is built out of these yellow bricks. Now here's a very fine example of tuck pointing, and if you look very carefully at this, you can see that the mortar joints are pretty wide here, not all that even brick. It's an 18th century house. Then it got all black with soot, and they have kept that black color on here, sometimes even repainting it, and then tuck pointing it with this very white mortar joint inlaid in the bigger original mortar joints. Does this look familiar to anybody? This is where you might expect really good tuck pointing. It's number 10 Downing Street. Sadly, you can't get near it to photograph it. I took this picture about 25 years ago, when we get close to it, but it's a good example of tuck pointing, and it's kept in very good condition there. The only example of tuck pointing I've seen in America on early buildings is in Charleston. And you see here a form of tuck pointing. Here are the red mortar joints here, and here you can see how this line of thin white mortar has been inlaid in the larger mortar joints. They've tried some reproduction tuck pointing in Charleston, and I don't think it came out very well. I mean, it takes real skill to do it. All right, press brick. By the mid-19th century, well, this is what, 1850s, the cities were making very precise bricks using brick-making machines. And a good example of this is this house in Williamsburg, a Greek Revival house on Duke of Gloucester Street. And it's described, we have building contracts for this, saying it's built out of Baltimore stock bricks. In other words, all these bricks were built or manufactured in Baltimore and shipped down to Williamsburg. And here's a close-up of it. Very precise mortar joints, very precise bricks, called press bricks because they were done with a very stiff clay using a brick-making machine which pressed the bricks by steam power into these metal molds to give you a very dense, very precise brick so you could get a beautiful, precise brick wall like this. Here are two examples in Richmond of early 20th century. Well, this might be late 19th century. Pressed brick facades with just common kill-run bricks on the sidewalls. This is facadism. So we get 7-course American bond on the sidewall here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Then a course of headers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then you see how they've tried to bond the pressed brick facade ever so often into the mortar joints of the side walls here. Kind of a coining system. This, they didn't bother, they just pushed butted the pressed brick facade up against the common bricks of the side wall. That's my own house over here. Built about 1912, but a good pressed brick facade. If you look carefully here, they tinted the mortar joints sort of a dark red, probably using a combination of iron oxide or maybe just ground brick dust, and maybe mixing some lamp black in it. Because around under my front porch, where it's really protected, the joints are almost black. Anyway. Now, very interesting brickwork, early 20th century brickwork. I noticed on this McKinley and White building down at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. How do you describe this? I think it's quite effective, because I haven't found a good name for it. Might call it either Flemish variant or English variant. What it is, it's a row of stretchers alternating with a row of stretcher header, stretcher header, stretcher header, as in Flemish bond. So is it English with Flemish variant, or is it Flemish with English variant? It's hard to say. But anyway, it gives, I think, a very interesting effect, especially when you have this blue flashing on the bricks here. Nice pattern to the wall. It would be interesting if somebody could specify this for a wall. Then we get into buff press bricks, because everybody was burning soft coal in the late 19th and early 20th century. All our cities were getting absolutely black, and particularly brick buildings. So they were producing a lot of this buff press brick rather than red press brick to give the buildings the look of stone. And because these were very smooth, hard surfaces, they kind of self-washed themselves with rain and whatnot. As far as I know, this wall has never been cleaned. It's on Capitol Square in Richmond. And rather beautiful brick with nice terracotta detailing. Here you have that frieze from the Erechtheion with the Enthymiones in it. Nice terracotta detailing on it. Pressed brick. Here's a triumph of light buff pressed brick on the Jefferson Hotel in Richmond. They wanted to have this clean, new look. make it look more like stone. Then another odd brick that came into the early 20th century is what we call tapestry brick. This is on an apartment house right near my house, 1920s. When you look close, it has all these striations. That's done with a special cutter that made these striations. And it's called tapestry brick because it looks sort of like the folds in a work of tapestry. And then, of course, we all got carried away with Colonial Williamsburg restoration. So there's an awful lot of replica Flemish bond with glazed headers, 18th century style, particularly in Virginia, aping what was going on in colonial America. Flemish bond with glazed headers, rub brick corners here. This is a Methodist church, kind of a hyperthyroid version of Bruton Parish Church in Williamsburg, with pretty good Flemish bond with glazed headers throughout. Here it is here. And it still can be done. This is a wing to that same church that was finished just 4 or 5 years ago. Beautiful Flemish bond with glazed headers, very good gauge brick round arches around the tops of the windows here and around this window here. Good masonry still can be done. You just need to search it out and be able to pay for it. And then in Williamsburg itself, they wanted to show in the shopping area at the end of Duke or Gloucester Street, Merchants Square, this was on a site of a church that wasn't any good, that had to be torn down. They wanted to show here what merchants' houses in England in that same period must have looked like. So they commissioned Quinlan Terry to design an English-style brick building of the mid-18th century, using fine brick detailing, such as you see here in this pedimented niche up here, and you have an actual Doric triglyph here in specially cut molded brick. You can order these details in England today. And this, I think, is a rather handsome new entry to the Museum of the American Revolution, just opened a couple of years ago, showing how you can use brickwork in the pediment here in Flemish bond and in a lighter color brick in pilasters and around the arcade openings here. They give a very effective composition here. All right, I want to end up with just a few favorites of mine of fine brickwork. Stratford Hall. I think this is very effective. This is like an Italian house. It has a piano nobile, high basement. And they, instead of coins or stone down here, they've emphasized the basement area by using Flemish bond with glazed headers and then even colored smaller bricks in the area above it, with relieving arches down here and then gauge brick jack arches above. And Stratford has these fabulous chimney clusters here, all done with molded bricks and Flemish bond with glazed headers. And Christ Church, Lancaster, which I showed you earlier. This has what we call scattered glazed headers, not an overall pattern, but scattered glaze just to give a sparkle, to give some interest and texture to the wall with these wonderful molded brick doorways, which you have to remember were probably color washed originally. And you notice the really fine gauge brick arch around the heads of the windows here. This is all original sash as well. Or a very rich example of it is this wing of the orangery at Kensington Palace by Nicholas Hawksmoor, using the yellow stock brick of London accented with red brick, coining around this large opening here and on the pilasters on the side. Really ingenious use of brick. Or Sir John Soane's Dulwich Art Museum. How do you make a brick wall without any openings in it interesting? Well, you do all of these blind arches here, getting the light and shadow here. A really ingenious use of brick structure and brick architecture. Or Lutyens, this is an amazing church, St. Jude's Church in Hampstead, done in the early 20th century, contrasting lighter brick with some glazing in it with these wonderful rich brick surrounds here on these tall windows. An ingenious use of brick here. These wonderful tall gables, slopes on the roof here. And look at the dome again. Real strong statement. Or the War Memorial in Richmond by Ralph Adams Cram, finished in the 1930s. Took a long time to get this built. A Georgian campanile, and you notice he's used all English crossbond here and lovely molded brick surround on these openings here. Now, and finally, the Pantheon, the supreme example of brick construction, all done on a circle with these big relieving arches here. Remember, on the other sides of the wall here are big niches carved in the wall. So that's a thin part of that wall here, so to spread the weight of this, tremendous weight of this dome and these brick walls around the inlaid relieving arches in the wall surface. Here's one down here. Here they are up here. An amazing bit of construction, all on a circle. So we went from the sublime to the ridiculous, and on that note, I think we need to finish. So thank you very much.